Hello, everyone.
Good evening and welcome.
Good to see you here. It's nice to be together again. So I see Fern and Sam are there, and Margaret, good to see you here.
Welcome, Margaret.
Yeah. I need to say, I'm always having to bail early for you guys, and it's going to happen again. I might not make it much past 9:30 my time tonight.
We're happy you're here.
No problem.
We're happy you're here.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. And I'll catch up on YouTube. I just saw that you would be posting these afterwards.
We have a YouTube audience right now, and then also the recording will be there. Yeah.
Right. That's what I just wanted to make sure of that. Yes. Yeah. So I'll catch up. In the meantime, in between. Yeah. I'll mute myself now. I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. I think we'll probably have some people coming in a little later, which often happens, but we'll get started here. We're diving into 4 weeks on spiritual activism and what that all is. And I'm quite excited about it because it's the kind of the heart of my life. Being spiritual and making action in the world from that place. So we welcome you.
So yeah, wonderful to welcome you. And we wanted to go into this time together to explore really how we combine spirituality and activism. And action in the world, it's really a very key combination. And so we will speak about several principles that we've developed over the years and worked with extensively. And so we're just waiting for a couple more people, and we're going to begin with some music.
We're going to begin with some music. And I'll tell you a little bit about why we're beginning with music again. First of all, this is going to be a very interactive course. Will and I will speak, but you'll also be going into small groups and talking about these principles that we will be introducing to you and how you resonate with them or don't, or how they relate to your life in whatever way, and how you hold it. So we're going to move into some music though, because behind pretty much every movement in the world, throughout the world, so often there is music and creative arts that is part of the thrust or the empowerment or the inspiration that help these movements live. And that's from the things in North America to Africa to, things around gender or race or climate change or the working poor. The suffragettes had music, So we're going to start each session with a little bit of music. And today we are going to hear from Judy Collins. And this is a song that was inspired by a poem from one of the suffragettes. And so, it was written by a man, I think. I'm going to pull up my notes, but I'll tell you more about that after we listen to it. We also want to welcome our YouTube audience as we get started. And we will be going into some small group activity. And what we'd like to encourage the YouTube audience to do is maybe pull out some paper or a journal and a pencil or pen, or do it on your computer. And when we're in small groups, you can do some journaling yourself and bring that back. You can also join us if you'd like to engage more one-on-one, and Garrett will post the link for you to have that, to join the Zoom call. So here, Garrett.
Can I just interrupt a minute? When I went into the Unity newsletter site and I tried to go into the Zoom link, it said that a password was needed. So I don't know if other people are having difficulty getting in.
So I just guessed it was Unity. That's how I got in.
Yeah. I think there's something going on.
Oh, you know what? Okay.
Yeah.
You want to send an email out to everyone again, Garrett? Or?
Yeah, I'm realizing what's happened.
You're smart, Nancy.
So
thank you for that heads up, Janet.
So if you're on YouTube and you're trying to get in, the password is Unity, all lowercase, and that'll.
It actually has a capital U.
Oh, a capital U. Okay. And Garrett, maybe you can get us going on the music. And before we go there, I just want to say one of my mentors during divinity school was Dr. Vincent Harding. And some of you have heard me speak of him before. He was a colleague and dear friend of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. Harding is the one that told me about the freedom fighters, or the freedom movement in the United States, which turned over the civil rights movement, or was part of the civil rights movement. They always started with spiritual kind of gospel songs. And they sang, and they brought that singing and that voice forward that kept them inspired, kept them going. So tonight, we're going to start with this song that I mentioned from that's inspired by a poem and from the suffragette movement. And each session will have a little music to inspire us too. So we'll get started, and you can close your eyes if that feels right, or just however you'd like to do it, and settle in here and listen to these words from Judy Collins. So let us march forward into this course and carry that music with us. I've got the information now of some of the names. The poem was written in 1911 by James Oppenheim, and it was soon after. It was inspired by a speech by American suffragette Helen Todd, who and the imagery of bread and roses. She worked for workers. She was an activist for workers' rights, and the bread was just bread on our table, and the roses, that was a symbol of the bread in the song. The roses is symbolic of social democracy and of socialism. And so, and then Judy Collins put it to a song, which is beautiful. So for those of you who have just joined, I was just saying we're going to include music into our course and bring up the song that motivates and inspires movements and continues to. And I encourage you to, during our course time, we're going to bring in, of course, prayer and meditation, which also is very important in our action in the world, and also bringing music into your life. And the things that inspire you through music and the arts are really key to our action in the world. So just finally, I'll say that we will be moving through this, the principles of spiritual activism, and there's 13 of them, and we'll each week go through 3 or 4. This week we're going to do 4, and then every other week we'll do 3. And we'll give you a link to find the copy of all of them. Garrett's going to give you that, or I will give you that. Right now I'm going to move off screen, and I'm going to go to my computer, and Will's going to share how these spiritual principles came to be. So I'll see you on another screen.
So good evening, everyone. Wonderful to welcome you to this course. I just wanted to give a little background about how these principles came to be. Back in the mid-1990s, well, from the 80s through to around 2006, somewhere for about 25 years, I worked quite actively in the environmental movement as an activist, as a scientist and activist, and working primarily on strategies to abate global warming and to change energy policy away from fossil fuels and nuclear power to advocate for energy conservation and renewable energy. And in the course of that, I was also doing my own spiritual training extensively. I did a number of retreats with different spiritual masters, like particularly Buddhist masters initially, and then also with Thich Nhat Hanh. He did a series of retreats for environmentalists, which were really wonderful back in the late 80s and early 90s. And so I was doing this kind of dual work of doing this activism outwardly and doing my spiritual retreat work. And there came when after Bill Clinton and Al Gore were elected, there was a group of senior politicians in Washington, D.C. who wanted to convene a group to support their spiritual activism. They were all senior government officials who had gone to Washington to be part of the administration there, working on environmental issues. And obviously with Al Gore there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of work that was being done at that time on the environment. And so I was fortunate to get invited to be one of the co-facilitators of this group, because I was a person who wasn't an activist myself, but I also had been heavily involved in spiritual practice for many years. And so I had kind of this requisite dual background. And so this work began in about 94, I think, roughly, and went for 2 or 3 years. And early on, after the first couple of retreats, we did generally one annual retreat a year, and then sometimes a summer retreat. So it was a winter retreat and summer retreat was our primary gatherings. And then we had sometimes meetings in between. And after the first retreat or so, I was asked to compile a set of spiritual principles that would be palatable to people who didn't have any interest in religion, but really wanted the spiritual wisdom, to encapsulate spiritual wisdom without bringing religion into it. So that was the idea. And I put together some principles that were originally 8 principles. And then over the next year or two, they sort of grew to 13 principles. And so that's how this got started, with these principles. And then we used these principles throughout that retreat time. And then afterwards, we continued to use them in our own work. And people found them helpful and valuable. And then they were picked up by other groups. And so we have sort of disseminated them to some degree to different groups. One in particular was Awakening the Dreamer, which is a group that was founded by Lynn Twist, and the whole movement that she started around awaking people up to, our reality and beginning to dream again, which came out of her work with the Pachamama Alliance and some of the indigenous shaman that she works with in Peru, who basically said that what needed to happen was that the North Americans needed a new dream. The dream that we had, essentially the American dream, was kind of the soul's nightmare in a way, the whole materialist dream, and that it needed to be replaced with another dream. So the idea was to awaken the dreamer to a whole different dream for the future of humanity. And so that was part of her work. And these principles were also picked up by other groups. We used them at the Global Eco-Village Network. And they were published in a book, and that's the link that we'll send you, that was co-authored by Maddie Harlan from England for the Global Eco-Village Network. And Maddie Harlan was the founder of Permaculture magazine. So that just gives you a little bit of background as to how these came about. But the basic idea behind them was to really articulate the essential need for doing inner spiritual work in order to be an effective agent of change outwardly. And there's a number of scriptural precedents for this. This is not really new at all. Although it seemed new at the time, it seemed, even to some of my colleagues, a little bit, I remember, for example, when I went off to spiritual retreats, when I was working at an activist center in Colorado, And some of my colleagues felt when I would go off to do a 7-day, 10-day retreat that I was wasting my time, navel gazing, going off, and that there's only a small number of us, working for the cause. And so it's important not to waste your time, gazing at your navel, but to come here and keep going with the work to save the earth. But I felt very clear that this was part of the activism, and that it was very important for us to develop spiritually and internally, first of all, to get proper guidance, to be able to be connected to a deeper wisdom than our own mental machinations about what's needed. Secondly, to develop the capacities of compassion and skills for working with adversaries in a helpful way. Because in the nature of social change activism, we are often challenging other human beings about their ideas and their policies. And sometimes it's an out and out struggle to have our actions and our policies adopted, and working really at odds with other groups that are trying to have opposite policies adopted. And so it's very important coming into adversarial dynamics and adversarial domains, in congressional hearings, in policy debates before the World Bank and the IMF and other forums where I was often appearing as an environmental scientist. It was really important for me to develop a way of being in these challenges and in these environments and stay centered and maintain a kind of empathic commitment to holding the interests of everyone while at the same time being committed to a particular outcome. So that's one of the things that we'll speak to in this. And I was very inspired by Thich Nhat Hanh, who said at one point, he said, what we most need to do is to hear within ourselves the sounds of the earth crying. In other words, as environmental activists, we need to connect directly to the pain of the earth and be able to then listen to the wisdom in that pain. So that became a really important teaching for me, and it's one that I then later applied in our gender equity and reconciliation work, which was that what we most need to do as men, for example, is to hear within ourselves the sounds of the female gender crying. In other words, we need to hear that pain and take that pain in. Otherwise, we don't know how to be, how to act. And we need to have our empathic awareness and consciousness awakened. And so that was a very important part of what Thich Nhat Hanh spoke to that I found very powerful. He also said that if you want to take care of the environment, we must take care of environmentalists. And I began to realize how important that was in general. If we want to take care of these issues that are so important in terms of social change, we must also take care of those who are out there on the front lines working to implement those changes, because it's challenging work and it's draining and it requires a kind of strength from within. We need to build up the inner strength. And so I began to work in that way myself. And then we began to organize a series of retreats for environmental activists, which we carried on for a number of years throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Things changed after 9/11 because the whole focus of our particular work shifted at that point. But we did these environmental retreats for many years. And so we applied these principles in that context. And I think I'll bring this little intro to a close with just a couple of basic teachings from the spiritual traditions. We will be drawing in wisdom from different sources and traditions as we move through these next 4 weeks and as we address these different principles. But one of the founding sort of core teachings comes from the great Christian mystic Meister Eckhart the 13th century Dominican, but he said it so eloquently and beautifully. He said, unless the inner work is great, no, he said, the outer work will never be great if the inner work is small. And the outer work will never be small if the inner work is great. So in other words, if we don't do our inner work, then if we set out to accomplish something outwardly in the world, it is limited by the fact that we haven't completely done the transformative work within ourselves that will enable us to be used as an instrument of divine will, if you will. And that will enable us to get our egos out of the way, in which case we can be far more effective. And then the other part that he said, if the inner work is great, the outer work will never be small. If we do that huge and transformative work inwardly, then even if our outer work is doing, as Mother Teresa said, small things with great love, it has profound reverberations. And there's a way in which we are working in that flow of divine will and divine service. And in so doing, our work, the work that comes through us, is more how I would say it, is great, because it is really divine work. And we are then being used as the instrument for a work that's far larger than we are. And we will also find that we are able to do many things and accomplish a tremendous amount without trying that hard. It doesn't mean that we're not fully engaged and constantly moving and working, but we are resting in an eternal peace and we don't burn out. This is so, so important that we learn to do that two-step of how to step out into the world in service and then to step back and recharge our spiritual batteries. And when we can do that back and forth, we then develop this capacity, this kind of diastolic, systolic, and diastolic two-step, which Evelyn Underhill said was the mark of the greatest spiritual leaders across all of humanity. And I'll just close this little piece by a little story from one of our friends and colleagues, Eugene Callender, who was working in Harlem. He's a pastor, and very effective pastor. And he had all kinds of social programs for the poor and for the youth at risk. And these were vibrant programs that he was the director of, but he gathered lots of people around him who were actually carrying them out. And he was asked at one point, how do you do all this? How do you possibly do so much? And he said, I don't do anything. I just stand still and God pushes me around. And that's the ideal of spiritual activism, is that actually we are not doing anything ultimately, that we are simply implementing, as Sri Aurobindo says so beautifully, when we come fully into the deepest truth of spiritual activism, we become one with the divine presence and really with the divine feminine, because the feminine is the agent of divine action in the world. And so the way he puts it is we become one with the Divine Mother so that her impulse and her consciousness comes through undistorted and unfiltered through us. So that's the prayer that I hold for myself, for the work that we do. And to do that, we need to stay attuned inwardly and keep doing that inner work and outer work and that two-step. It's like breathing. We breathe in. We are nurtured by that in-breath. If you didn't breathe in, you could never breathe out and you would die soon. And if you constantly tried to breathe out, you would suddenly be gasping for air. But if you have a rhythm of the breath, you stay centered, you stay peaceful, and you stay vibrant and alive. So that's the essence of the whole course right there. That's what the whole principles are about and the practices. So I think Cynthia is going to begin with going through the first principle, and then we're going to have some time in small groups to address these.
And I love Nancy, I love your dog. That's great. We got other beings on the call here, on the course. This is wonderful. Welcome to all who have just joined, and we also continue to invite the YouTube audience to join if you'd like. Garrett's put the link in your chat on YouTube if you want to join. I'm going to share my screen and bring up the first principle, and I'll read it, and then I'm going to share a little experience in my own life of how it relates to my life. Then we'll move into some small groups where you can share yourself. So let me do this. And there we go. So the first principle is transformation of motivation from anger, fear, despair to compassion, love, and purpose. This is a vital challenge for today's social change movement. This is not to deny the noble emotion of appropriate anger or outrage in the face of social injustice. Rather, this entails a crucial shift from fighting against evil to working for love. And the long-term results are very different, even if the outer activities appear virtually identical. Action follows being, as the Sufi saying goes. Thus, a positive future cannot emerge from the mind of anger and despair, from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, transformation of motivation from anger, fear, despair to compassion, love, and purpose. And Garrett's going to put that first principle in the chat box, so when you move into your groups, you'll still have it. But I just wanted to share briefly, some of you have heard one of my stories about, let me set my timer here so I don't go over time. So I've heard my story about making it through my master's degree in wellness management, gerontology, and I was just starting my career as a young woman. I had 2 children. I was divorced. I was ready to take on the world. I had been studying with a world-renowned health and wellness expert, and I had studied about him, and I was going to get to work with him then because I landed a job in Indianapolis in the States. And I worked there for 5 months. I was middle management. I was quite excited about it. I was going to start traveling with this world-renowned man, white man, Christian, 20, 30 years my senior, expert in the field. I was very excited. However, on a business dinner, he sexually propositioned me. He said, "Cynthia, I've enjoyed getting to know you. Now it's time to take our relationship to a deeper, more intimate sexual level." I said no, and he didn't hear my no. He continued to pressure me that evening, but also then throughout the week at work. And so I decided to bring it forward. And I did so with as much compassion in my heart, as much love in my heart as I could, knowing we're in a system and everything. And I just want to speak about being a white woman in the States, middle class, well, maybe lower middle class, being a single mom. But it was really the first time in my life that I had to really speak my truth against the patriarchal system, against the system that oppresses many. And it put me in a place of better understanding of what my brown and black sisters have gone through, and still not even being in the same place of privilege. I just want to name that because it is different around race and culture of how these things happen. But I brought it forward and he apologized. I the corporation, though, I stayed for about a week, and it was horrific. I felt like my throat was going to get cut at any moment. I literally and figuratively. My emails were hacked personally. My mother's, my family's emails were hacked. The court, at one point, an anonymous person said that I was abusing my own children and they were bringing charges against me, things like this. I was losing everything. I was literally losing everything because of his actions. The corporation hired 6 attorneys to keep me quiet. And then they offered me $1,000 if I'd sign a memorandum saying I'd never speak about it again. And I chose to not take that money. It wasn't about me losing, you know, and about me trying to be vindictive or anything. It was about speaking truth. And I wasn't out for blood. I really wanted change. But when I left that, when I got pushed out of that job, I couldn't trust men anymore. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to be around men, but I also couldn't trust women because they betrayed me too. They had to keep their jobs. And it took a lot of therapy, a lot of healing work. It took a few years of that to get through that process. And that this principle of turning, you know, the anger that I had and the betrayal I had, the despair I had, into love and compassion and deeper understanding was the process I was in. So it didn't come easily, but it did happen. And ultimately, it led me into the work that I'm doing now with Will and our gender community. And so it reaped very beautiful, and it sowed great seeds, beautiful work to come. But I had to go through that process and not be angry about it, but really come to a deeper place of understanding. So that's an example of how it's worked in my life. You may not have something the same way. It may be something very different, or maybe you've witnessed someone in that place. It may be that it was with the whole community, or maybe you've seen it in world events or something like this. So you can take this wherever you feel you want to. And we're going to move into groups here in a moment. You'll have, I think, 20 minutes for the group. You'll be in groups of 4 and 3 or 4. I see people coming and going here, so I'm not sure how Garrett has it configured. Garrett will give you time markers as you go, just to kind of know, okay, should be the first, second, third. You might want to be in a discussion. If you want to do that, then just make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. Will, do you want to say anything else?
I don't think so, because I'll be speaking about the next principle. So. Okay.
Is there any questions for clarity, or is everyone good to go?
Is there a specific question you want us to answer? Or is it more general? Like, do you want us to take an example that we've had in our own life?
Yeah, is that more that, Nancy, and just how this principle maybe has been in your life, or how maybe you've never thought about it. So how is it hitting you now? How's it landing for you now? That kind of thing. And if you're on YouTube, we encourage you to stay on, but just maybe do some journaling around this, or take some time for reflection about it. And like I said, Garrett's put it in the chat, so you can find it there, okay? The actual principle. We'll see you shortly.
Okay, I'll go ahead and open the rooms now, and I'll send you some time reminders along the way.
It's the man behind the unity symbol speaks.
And for our friends on YouTube, I'm going to just put up a slide with this first principle. And you can take some time to journal or reflect or be with it however works for you. So here it is. And the link to join the meeting is in the chat there on YouTube. So if you'd like to sign on, please just do so and I can put you in a room.
So the YouTube audience, welcome back, and we hope you find some time for journaling and things like that. So welcome back, everyone. We hope you had good groups.
So welcome back. Good to see you. And hope you found these valuable groups. We're now going to move to the second principle, which I think Cynthia will put up on the screen. So this one is a classic, a challenging one, and that is non-attachment to outcome, something difficult to hold when you're striving for a particular transformation of a form of injustice or something that has motivated you to action. So I'll read the principle. Non-attachment to outcome is difficult to put into practice. Yet, to the extent that we are attached to the results of our work, we rise and fall with our successes and failures, a sure path to burnout. Hold a clear intention and let go of the outcome, recognizing that a larger wisdom is always operating. As Gandhi said, the victory is in the doing, not the results. Also remain flexible in the face of changing circumstances. Planning is invaluable, but plans are useless. So that comes from Winston Churchill. And basically, this principle is, I think, one of the more important reasons why doing our inner work and having essentially an inner spiritual discipline and practice is so important, because it helps us stay connected to something larger than the immediate essence of the goals that we're working toward. And it helps us hold the whole work in a larger framework. So, you know, when I was working as an environmental activist, I noticed in my early days that it was easy to get very caught up in feeling that I was doing this righteous work and engaged in battling the forces of darkness, if you will. And there's a quality of self-righteousness that can come in, which can be a kind of a corruption of one's own motivation. And also what it does when you're sort of collapsed into only focused on the goal, and there is a kind of identification with the goal, then there is a loss of circumspect, a loss of larger awareness. I remember when I was working in that group I mentioned in Washington, DC, and there was a government lawyer, very effective, who worked for the US federal government for the environmental communities. And he could not bear with this principle. He said, I have to be attached to outcome. There's no way I couldn't be. He said, when I'm in that courtroom, if I lose, the earth loses. And if I lose, those trees come down and those bulldozers roll and vast areas are destroyed. And he was not wrong. This man was the one who did the legal work behind the saving of large tracts of land, particularly in Utah area during the late stages of President Clinton's administration, when he was able to put significant areas of land into federal protection. And they were challenged in the courts, and this man was defending those lands. So he really felt totally identified with it. And he really kind of stormed out of our course, out of our retreat series, because he said, I can't embrace this. It doesn't make any sense to me. But then he kept coming back. And he kept coming back year after year, and he changed, and his whole approach softened because he realized that there was a larger holding that needed to happen, and that he could learn to hold his opponents in his heart, even as he was striving for a particular outcome. And that was really the key. I also found that I was much more effective when I learned how to hold the dignity and the presence of every human being engaged in this group in my heart, and really holding their best interests at heart, even when I was engaged in an adversarial kind of struggle, so that I was able to take the stand that I was taking, but at the same time keep a smile in my eye, keep an eye-to-eye and heart-to-heart connection with those I was trying to convince otherwise, and to hold them in a place of compassion and mutual humanity, and not in this adversarial way. And this non-attachment to outcome really served in that regard. I also realized that sometimes there's a larger outcome that the divine has in mind, which would be betrayed by striving for a smaller near-term outcome. So sometimes even when we lose the immediate struggle or battle, there's a larger winning, if you will, that comes into play. So this principle is really important about staying connected to the spirit of the work and not rising and falling with the ups and downs. And it helps us to stay balanced and to stay centered. So that's just a little brief intro to this principle. And we'd like to now, again, move into small groups and invite you to address, how have you worked with this principle when you are involved in something that you're passionate about, and perhaps in a struggle or engaged with? And how have you been able to work with this principle of working for a particular outcome while not being overly attached to it, so that you can actually stay in this dual role of working for an outcome, but not collapsing into that so much that you lose this larger perspective and that you lose your center? That's really, I think, the key to this principle, which is what Gandhi taught in his whole form of spiritual activism. So we're going to move into groups again. I think you'll be in different groups this time, and really invite you to address this principle of non-attachment to outcome when you are moving into spiritual service, and particularly when you're perhaps moving into an area of potential conflict. So Garrett, are you ready to?
Yes, so I will go ahead and open the breakout rooms again.
And again, the people on YouTube, we welcome you to do some journaling or reflection on this. So we're coming back, and welcome back, YouTube folks. We hope your reflection time was good, and the rest will be joining us in just a moment. We'll move into the third principle here in a moment, or third and fourth, and then we'll have some, after one more small group time, we'll have some full group time together. So a little more active engagement for all of you on YouTube.
So thank you for staying with us here.
Welcome back, everyone. Oh, Terry has joined us. Welcome,
Oh,
Terry.
welcome. Hello, Terry. Welcome back,
you.
everyone. Good to see you all.
Why don't we do a little stretch? Yeah, doesn't that feel good? We need some music on, a little dance again. Roll your shoulders, wiggle your head, feet, wiggle your fingers. Little tapping. Yes, make sure your body feels alive. That feels good.
Yeah, that feels good. Thank you for that. So we're going to do one more principle, and then we'll have one more small group, and then we'll come back and we'll sort of harvest from all of these small groups the wisdom that is emerging, the collective wisdom from this wonderful group. So this last principle has to do with integrity. And this is really important in this day of fake news and alternate, distortions of truth. And the principle is integrity is your protection, and that we need to have integrity in means and ends. So I'll just read it here. If your work has integrity, this will tend to protect you from negative energy and circumstances. You can often sidestep negative energy from others by becoming transparent to it, allowing it to pass through you with no adverse effect upon you. This is a consciousness practice that might be called psychic aikido, getting out of the way of negative energy. And then the second one, integrity in means and ends. And this is pretty clear, but it's very important that we must have integrity in our methods and our implementation in order to achieve a noble goal. So integrity in means cultivates integrity in the fruit of one's work, and a noble goal cannot be achieved using ignoble means. So this, as I said, in this time of fake news, never has it been more important, the principle that Christ taught, that the truth shall set you free. And in the Gospel of Thomas, he makes it a little more clear what that process is. He says, the truth shall set you free, but first it will disturb you, and then it will astonish you, and finally you will reign over all things. So by clinging to truth, as Gandhi called it, satyagraha, clinging to truth, we eventually, it confers upon us, as Gandhi said, a matchless and universal power that cannot fail us. And this is something that is true in every aspect of our lives, but it's particularly important when we're entering into an adversarial context. And this principle of psychic aikido was something I hit upon accidentally in my own activism when I was challenging the nuclear industry. And I ended up finding myself as a whistleblower embedded in this whole institute that had done this whole study in which there was data manipulation, which I stumbled upon. And I spent a couple of years of my life documenting it and bringing it out into the public arena and publishing it. It wasn't what I intended, but it sort of fell to me to do. And there's a long story there, but here's the short story relating to this principle. There was a conference in which the head of this whole group that had conducted this study over 7 years was at a major conference. And I was in the audience. I hadn't seen him in over a year. And he knew I had sent him, of course, my reports that I was critiquing his project. I sent him those reports. And the final report that I sent, which was long, it was 140 pages, but there was a whole section I'd taken out, which was about 60 or 70 pages, in which I was almost able to prove that they had deliberately manipulated the data. And I had like 95% of the proof, but that last few percent I didn't fully have. And so at the last minute, I took all that out of the report and never put it in there. And I was very grateful sitting in the audience. So I had what I thought was a weaker document, but I still had them. I had the data and I had a smoking gun that I was able to show. So I had the goods. But when I was sitting there in the audience, he saw me in the audience and he began to grill me with his eyes. And I looked away. I looked away because it was so intimidating. And then I couldn't look at this man. And then I sat there thinking, what's wrong with me? What have I done wrong? And then I went through a whole review of what I had done. And I realized that I had acted in integrity. That not that I was perfect, but in that report, every single calculation down to the last digit was absolutely defensible. Every time I had make an assumption, I leaned it against my own case, because this was a critical kind of criticizing someone else's work and challenging the integrity of it. So I had to be in impeccable integrity. And in that report, I knew it was. And so then I thought, well, why am I then unable to look at this man in the face? You know, I was looking this way or that way, but I couldn't just make eye contact. And once I realized that, suddenly I thought, well, what am I going to do? Because this man was, 30 years my senior. He was very imposing, had a very intense energy. And suddenly into my mind, I was a scientist. I was a young, 30-year-old postdoc scientist. And suddenly this image came into my mind of a prism. So it was an answer to my prayer. I wouldn't have called it prayer then, but I was praying desperately. But as a scientist, my answer came in a scientific image of a prism with high energy gamma rays going through this prism, but they couldn't touch it because the prism was pure. There wasn't any darkness, any little specks of impurity that could absorb that energy, which would have then melted and burned the prism up. But since there were no impurities in the prism, those high energy gamma rays passed right through it, and the prism was unharmed. And I suddenly realized, oh, wow, I can just be that prism. So that image was given to me, and then I decided to try that as a practice. And so eventually our eyes met, and this man then, same thing happened. He started sending all this intimidating energy, and I simply just let it pass through me. And as I did so, he started cranking up the intensity. And then I began to watch with a kind of horror, really, how this man was trying to destroy me with this energy of intimidation. And it was very strong and very potent, but I just held the gaze. I knew that I had done nothing wrong, that there was integrity in what I had done, and that there was importance in bringing this data to the truth, and to stand in that place, not in a defensive way, but in a naked way. And standing in that way, I just sat there until he eventually looked away. And then for the rest of that conference, whenever we met in a hallway or anything, he couldn't look at me. And I realized that in his mind, we entered some stare down contest and I had won. I never even thought of it that way. I was simply standing in the integrity of the work that I'd done. And I knew that it was done well and without something to hide. And so was able to be present even in the presence of that strong, intimidating energy and not be swayed by it. So that was an example of how your integrity is your protection, because that integrity protected me from that very negative energy which passed through me. And I applied that principle ever since in debates and struggles. As long as I know that I'm in integrity, I know it doesn't mean that I'm invincible. Someone could still attack me and someone could even hurt me physically, but in my own being, I have a clear heart. And so I can stand in the presence of even strongly adversarial energy and know that I am in integrity with who I am here to be and the work that I do. And so that's the key in this principle. So we want to give you just a few minutes to meet in small groups to talk about integrity in your own life and in your own work and how it has been your protection. And we've all had times when we haven't lived up to it as well. So you might give examples of that. And we've all had times where we have, but it's a very important thing to work with. And
you also may have people that you've seen working with integrity that you really appreciate, and you can bring that forward. So however you want to move into this particular principle, or these two.
Would it mess things up just to be able to read it again for myself?
No.
Not at all.
I actually find that fun.
Garrett has it in the chat box. So
thank you.
There you go. And we're going to give you a link for all the principles that you can take home with you. So there it is in the chat box, and you can go on into your groups now. Thank you.
So we'll see you in about 15 minutes, and then we'll have time to harvest everything.
And welcome back to the YouTube people. We're glad
Hello,
you're
everyone.
still with us. We'll have everyone joining us in just a minute. There we are. Okay. Welcome back, everyone.
So, welcome back, everyone. Lovely to see you all. And we will finish with really an open forum on all three of the principles. One little piece I forgot to mention, I just want to throw in there, is that on this integrity as your protection, when I was sitting there and realized that I had taken that section out of that report, I was so glad I had done so. Because if I hadn't done so, I would never have been able to look this man in the eye. I would have felt like he saw that I did that and he knows that I did that, and I wouldn't have been in integrity. And so even though at the time it was difficult for me to do what was in integrity, later I was so grateful because it enabled me to know that I had had done this work in integrity. So that's one of those ways in which we all have learned at times that to be in integrity is so important, even when it feels costly. Okay, so.
What are some of the jewels that you found out, or the questions that you pondered, or whatever? Whoever wants to open up.
Yeah, and we'll do it from all three of our principles, and we'll just remind you what those are. The first one is transforming motivation from anger and fear into constructive action.
Love, compassion.
And love and compassion.
Understanding.
And that's very important because pretty much all social justice programs begin with a kind of moral outrage. And that becomes the fuel for the work. But if it becomes the sustaining energy, it will corrupt the whole thing. So that's the first principle. The second principle was this importance of non-attachment to outcome. And then the third one, the one we just addressed, was that integrity is essential and is your protection. So we just open it up now for any reflections, thoughts, insights that emerged from your small groups, for who would ever like to speak.
In this moment, I love that one.
Yeah, that's beautifully spoken, and couldn't have said it better. You really articulated it beautifully. And you're right, they all contain one another, because in a sense, in that transformation from anger and fear to love and compassion, that kind of gives birth to all the other dimensions of them. So thank you for that.
One thing I just want to say, though, with that is that's important to say is moving from that anger and fear does not mean staying in an abusive or a unjust situation. And sometimes
thank you. Really important.
Yeah, and not becoming a doormat and just being all love. There's tough love. Tough love speaks truth to what's happening, and sometimes that can be very firm and direct, but it's being clear in yourself. So you're not eating yourself up with the anger and fear. You're just.
I think I started being nice, but being like, if there's violence or there's it's like not safe. You gotta be clear.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Exactly.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions or challenges that this brought up, or objections? Those are welcome as well.
Are there any of them that you liked more than others, or found more difficult to wrap your head around? Shirley, are you ready to speak? You're muted yeah.
I was thinking about the integrity as your protection one. And and I do get the importance of integrity. I do get that. And it strikes me also, though, with some very great spiritual teachers, that integrity did not protect them from violence, for example. For me, it's like, it's your protection, but it's not a guarantee.
No.
There's a certain essential, yeah, that's what just has struck me in this, you know. Yeah, I mean, I think your essential self is protected, but one's physical body may not be.
Very true, very true.
Yeah, no, that's very important. And that's why I said, you know, it doesn't mean you're invincible.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, and especially when we look at the number of, true spiritual activists who have paid with their lives for their stances through assassination or whatever. I mean, that's very important. But there's a way in which even Jesus was often protected, prior to the end. And same with Martin Luther King. I mean, they came through lots of scrapes. And in a certain sense, at least in the case of Jesus, if we read the Bible right, maybe that was supposed to happen. I don't know. I should say that differently, because I'm not convinced that that was supposed to happen. There are those who say it was required in order for that reconciliation between humanity and God to take place, that the crucifixion had to happen. I don't personally think that's probably necessarily the case, but the crucifixion of our whole attachment to the ego had to happen. But anyway, I don't want to get into all of those questions, but I don't want to deny what you're saying. It's absolutely true.
But having said that, I really do experience the truth of this, that if I can be in my integrity, then I'm not vulnerable to kind of emotional attack, in the same way. That I totally get that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very important. Thank you for bringing that in. And it's true, because you're not vulnerable to, when you really are able to stand in your integrity and your humility, then you're able to stand in even a very adversarial position or minority position and still stand there, even in the midst of significant criticism coming your way, and knowing that you're standing in your truth as best you see it. And so that does protect you from the negative energy of that criticism.
That's an aspiration, to be there for me.
What I would try, if you get into that situation, is try to visualize yourself as a transparent crystal.
Yeah, I like that.
Because what you're doing when you're doing that, you're not denying it. You're registering it, but you're not hanging on to any of it.
Yeah, letting it pass through.
That's right. But you're not sidestepping. You're not pretending it's not there. You're not looking the other way. You're facing it, but you're not letting it impact you, even though you're registering its consciousness and its message. So you're hearing it, you're receiving it, but you're also transmitting it right back out the other side, so it doesn't take hold in you.
Is that the spiritual Aikido?
Yes.
When I thought about that, I thought I would rather be in that place transmitting it, because the other place is one where I'm attacking myself inside. Like coming from integrity, whether the physical body is harmed or not, I'd rather have that than the negativity inside of me fighting with the true part of myself, if you know what I mean. So maybe that's the same thing as you saying it's like a crystal.
That's what I'm saying. And it really is what you just said. It's really passing it through. And the image of a crystal is just a mental image, but the idea of it is really important. Because when you stand when you know that you're in your integrity and that you're taking a stance in truth, then you can hold that place. And even when others are disturbed by it or attacking the thing that you've put forward, you can hear their energy, you can hear their critique, you can receive, even when they're criticizing you for your taking that stance, or maybe you took some actions they think were out of integrity, but if you know that they weren't, and you know that they were in alignment with what you were supposed to do, and you can stand firm in that, then you can receive that criticism, but you are not letting it land in your being, you're passing it directly through you. And it's a very important practice. And it's something that I think also therapists learn to do.
Yeah, I was going to say that they do.
Healers learn to do. You know, in the breath work that we do, working with people and they're really processing intense, you know, emotional or psychosomatic releasing, there's a lot of negative energy coming off of them. It's very important to be able to transmit that, not absorb it, but simply allow it to pass through you. Yeah.
And this is on an individual level and also collective. So when you're hearing the news, reading the news, the energetic vibrations happening around you to do the same sort of thing that we're talking about here, so that you're not taking it in. Yeah, Bill.
Could we follow through with the analogy of the prism? Because when light goes through a prism, if we're talking about a real prism, what comes out is a spectrum of different colors. Mm-hmm. So there could be a whole different outcome by allowing that just to go through you and coming out. Mm-hmm. The end result could be beautiful.
That's beautiful, Bill. And in a certain way, and I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right, there is a spectrum. And in a certain way, if you're really in your integrity and that energy is coming, you can be, even unwittingly, you're not trying to be, but you are actually being an instrument of transmutation of that dark energy, as you're saying.
Yeah.
And it is transformed into something. Because one thing the person attacking you needs is for you to receive their attack. I didn't realize it, but when that man looked away from me, I realized he thought he had lost. I wasn't even engaged in a struggle. But in his mind, that whole affront didn't work. So I don't know what impact that may have had on him, but maybe it transmuted something in him around that whole approach. I don't know, but I can imagine that that could happen. Because in Aikido, you know, that's what happened. An Aikido master in a physical art, they're actually taking that force that's coming on them and they step out of the way and they turn around. And what happens, that force comes around and then kind of it comes back to the attacker in a certain way. And maybe that's what happens there, I don't know. But transmuting it into a rainbow, a beautiful rainbow is a beautiful image to hold. Thank you for bringing that in.
Welcome.
Another interesting way to look at this currently is because we are in form and we're surrounded by information. And so that to let some of this pass through us. So it's interesting because there's, we're embedded in 724 news, of which a lot of it is quite negative. So I think it's really important for all of us to let it go through us and maybe take little samples just so we know what's kind of going on. But basically we are being informed. And so I think we need to all be really conscious of that all the time.
That's beautiful, Terry. And in a certain way, as Bill was saying, if we can stand in that place of clarity and transparency, then we are an instrument of transforming that information.
Exactly.
That's great.
Everyone's awareness.
One thing that I wanted to just say is that in spiritual activism, I have felt many times that kindness can be a big trigger for people. And I'd never really thought about that in that way, that sometimes when you are kind, it can really rile people up. And I think sometimes, well, very important that kindness is part of spiritual activism, yet sometimes people can really blow up when you're kind and compassionate. So it's a really important thing that I've had to remember in my life.
Very, very important. We're going to talk about that in a subsequent course, but since you brought it up, I'll just bring in the principle. You can be reflecting on it. There's a saying in Sufism that Sufis are the most loved of all human beings. And then the next sentence, Sufis are the most hated of all human beings. And it's because of this what you're speaking to. Because when you really are connected to the source and foundation of divine love, you are not playing by the rules of the collective society. You are literally playing by this, you're not playing. You are basically an instrument of that larger divine love. And that was what makes it so profound and why people love spiritual masters and Sufis so much. But they're not obeying the normal social rules, and sometimes they go quite at odds to them. And that can cause real tension sometimes for people. So yeah, thank you for bringing that in. We'll address that later in the course.
We need to bring closure tonight. I know, Shirley, maybe you have something before you say something. I just want to bring your attention to the chat. I posted in there a link for a free book that Will edited called Song of the Earth. And on page 214 to 219 are the spiritual principles, but you have the whole book too, which is nice. So, and we will at the end be giving you all the principles anyway on a PDF that we'll give to you as well.
Great.
Shirley, if you have to leave.
I was in light of Janet's comment about you never know how people are going to react. I was going to say, is one of the principles don't take it personally.
Yeah, exactly. That's very important.
It's a very, very good one. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to bring closure to tonight. We'll be back next Monday. And of course, we're around each day of the week, Monday through Saturday, if you want to join us for meditation. Some of you on this call will join that. And as it is every time and every program is through love offerings. So if you are so moved, please, Garrett's putting the link in the window for your love offerings, donations. And when you give those, please put in that this was for the Monday night class, and that way the church knows where it's coming from. And we love you. We love that you showed up here tonight and gave 2 hours of your time for all of us to be in community and be engaged in this important conversation.
Come together to work with.
Sorry. That's all right. So yes, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your donations and support of this course and of Unity programs. And we look forward to seeing you a week from tonight.
Be well, friends.
Be well.
We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.